be opening up the conversation to members of the audience as well, and my colleagues here on the panel will also be sharing with us their own personal experiences on the night the great Madiba passed on. As much as many of us in the media were anticipating that moment, somehow when the day or when the moment arrived, we went into denial. And I'm sure my colleagues, processed the information through several lenses: personal, cultural, professional, political, not knowing how to go about it and who to wait for. Now, I wanted to start with Tate Thabo Masebe here, who was in the presidency at the time. Anyway, let me do it the right way. Yeah. Thabo Masebe was in the presidency at that time, and he's with the Gauteng government, so he's going to speak from that perspective. Next to him is Sally Burdett, who is with the ENCA, and Milton Nkosi of the BBC, Angie Kapelianis of the SABC. I used to battle to say the name right, so somehow I think I got it right. But anyway, we'll continue to practice. And Mondli Makanya of the City Press, and welcome. And many of my colleagues in the audience, welcome to you all. So, Mondli, let me start with you. As an extremist on the
left-wing extremist.
Anyway, tell me, on the night of this announcement and prior to the announcement, because people depended on the rumors that were going around at the time, including on the day. Anyway, where were you, and what was going on in your newsroom, or how did you mobilize your colleagues to cover the story?
Well, on that particular night, because the rumors started circulating during the day and went into the evening, and we're trying to confirm everything, but it was all about, it was a wait and see. And we're a Sunday paper, so obviously we've got the time, and although we've got an online presence, the main thing was to make sure that all our ducks are in a row for Sunday. But then on that particular night, I was actually with the man next to you there, Thabo. We were with some friends in a restaurant and all trying to confirm, and he tells the story a lot better than I do. So I'll let him tell that part.
Yeah.
Yeah, the earlier part. I'll tell you about the latter part.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then after that, after the announcement had been made, we then ran off to Soweto, to Gudagazi Street, to take in the ambience and basically to talk to people, to be part of it. And I must say, on that particular day, I took off my editor cap, and I took off my journalistic cap, and toyed with the masses, and honored him in that particular way. Mm-hmm. And the following day, I put my editor's cap back on.
And started thinking properly now on how to tell the story. So, Angie, I mean, SABC is a big operation, right? And with so many radio stations and channels, television channels, as well as digital media, I'm sure the planning was huge. But how prepared were you as the SABC, and you personally, what was your involvement?
We were pretty prepared. I think radio was more prepared than TV, and I think what it highlights and shows is that every one of us brings a different perspective, and it's going to be interesting to see who was where and how you were looking at that day, the build-up and what happened. I was personally responsible for coordinating the radio news and current affairs coverage. On that day, I was busy working. Our journalists were at the house. It was humming. I recall having what I call 5 headaches because I took 5 Panados. And eventually I went home, and just as I got home, I got a phone call. It's time. And I'm like, what do you mean it's time? It's time. And I'm like, do I activate the network? And I had to do a certain activation, and then the others would activate the rest. And I went back to work. And it was, I think the most difficult thing for me was working in Johannesburg, but SABC Radio has all these radio stations and all these teams across the country. And with hindsight, I wish I had one button, like an intercom, that could have just pressed the button and say, do this, do that. So I was on the phone, I was on the cell phone, I was behind the computer. And I remember many years ago saying to the sports team, when this happens, you just come to work. And all of a sudden, there were 5 people standing in front of me saying, you said we must be here, we're here. And I'm like, Janet, you're in the studio. Sam, here's the lever arch file for all the sound bites and the bulletins and the quotable quotes. the three of you TV guys, you go and video edit upstairs. And we were literally plugged into the union buildings, I think also just officially as the national public broadcaster. And when President Zuma made the announcement, I recall it as 22:30, 10:30, there was no turning back. So there was a slight moment of freeze framing and standstill, but the adrenaline was running, and it doesn't matter how prepared we were never prepared enough, because there was no turning back that clock. And as news, we had to go for 48 hours non-stop, and then we handed over back to the radio stations, and then we had this broadcast of the grieving and mourning period, and in between that celebration of his life, all the way to the funeral in the Eastern Cape.
Sure, and Leanne will tell us more later on about what happened on the television side. But Sally, from ENCA's point of view?
Yeah, also very much a wait-and-see situation. For me personally, just 3 months prior, I joined ENCA management full-time. Before that, I'd been a freelance newsreader. And on that particular day, I'd done a normal day's work and popped into Mapia Mhlangu's office, and she was getting phone calls. This was at about 7 o'clock. We knew something was happening or had just happened or was about to happen. Also, we were tracking the activity in Qunu and also outside the Houghton House. And Mapi kept making a phone call, I think, to someone in the presidency, and she would say, can we go? Can we go home? And she was told, just wait. At about 8 o'clock, the decision was made. I was the most senior anchor around at that stage. Our top team had just left. That I was to have makeup put on. Then I remember Ben said, who was working with us at the time, said, no, we cannot put Sally on prematurely because we're going to be accused of being alarmist, because if we put a senior anchor on, it's going to indicate something to our audience. And we were very mindful of the criticism the media had received in those months prior, when Madiba had been in hospital and there'd been all the critical but stable, but is he, but isn't he? And we'd really been, I think rightfully chastised about not jumping the gun on this. I'll never forget, Deborah Patty said, this is the one story you don't want to be first on. You don't. So we were very mindful of that. And the other thing that happened is when we were all gathering in the office at about, I think it was about 10 o'clock, roughly, late at night, waiting for news, discussing our plan, exactly how we'd roll it out, Mapi looked down at her phone and she just gasped and she said, oh, there's an announcement coming in 20 minutes. And she just looked at me, she says, get to the studio. I literally ran to the studio, got mic'd up, and I think we had about 10, 15 minutes before President Jacob Zuma came on air and made that announcement that we all knew was coming, but really it's very hard to process in the moment.
Well, Milton, I would like you to give us the international media's perspective on this and the extent to which, as organizations, international media organizations, you prepared for this. Because, people had to be flown in once the announcement was made, and pre that, producers were put here in South Africa, and it had happened before that there was a false alarm. They came and thought that they would cover the story. So it takes a huge amount of resources to plan for this, isn't it? Because I personally heard on the night from an international media organization, CBS to be specific, around 9 o'clock, to say, can you come and tell us about this? I said, no, to my mind, he's still alive. You may think it's the right thing to do. I don't think it's the right thing to do. But be that as it may, that was how the night turned out. From your point of view, as part of the international media and your organization specifically, what happened?
Yeah, sure. Just like everybody here, we were planning for Mr. Mandela's passing, for the coverage of his passing for many years. In fact, we started planning the day he came out of prison, because we were at the time very concerned that his security detail was not near adequate enough. And there was a fear that some right-winger would come and stand in front of him and shoot him. And in fact, the right-winger did do that to Chris Hani. So we didn't take this as a joke. We took it very seriously. And I don't know if you know, but in the UK, there is a proper plan for the burial of some of the most prominent royals. And the BBC itself, and I'm sure many other broadcasters, they do what are called simulated drills. So on one day, they just block the day, and they say breaking news, so-and-so has died, move to your stations, and people go exactly just like a fireman would do when there's a phone call coming announcing a fire. So everybody moves to their position. And we had done this a few times ourselves, just trying to plan the flights, getting people in, engineers, technology, satellites. It's quite a big operation, this. Now, what you've got to remember is that, I don't know, you know, in South Africa, I think we're too close to the situation. We know Nelson Mandela is big and he freed us, but we have no idea what Nelson Mandela means to the world. Absolutely, we are miles apart. When you leave South Africa, Nelson Mandela is bigger than he is here. I'm talking today,
Yes.
okay?
Yeah.
Now, when he was alive, the world remembers him, you know, quite, you know, in a much more prominent way than we do. And that is what the editors were getting from their audiences, that we want this, we want this. And that's what we had to prepare for. Now, take your mind back to 2004 when the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, had died in Paris. And his body had returned to Ramallah. It was absolutely chaotic. You can Google it and look at it on YouTube. That's exactly what we didn't want, okay? So at some point, Yasser Arafat's coffin had disappeared. There's just so many people around it. Now, the last thing you want to do is to have that here, okay? So part of the planning is to try and mitigate all of that sort of stuff. And we got the call. Already we were, just like everybody else, we were working the phones. We were hearing people are moving to Houghton. People look like they're in tears, they're serious, you know. So at that point, we already had a blueprint of the plan, which was a very long blueprint. And the call was just who makes the call, you know, just like Angie explained. You just have to say, this is it, let's go. And particularly because of the experience we had a few months earlier while Mr. Mandela was in hospital, there was a false alarm and we brought everybody. And that was very costly. So we were very careful not to repeat the same mistake again. But I was outside Houghton leading up. We were talking to friends, family friends, and it was sort of getting really clear that this is the moment. And of course, one of the most important things to remember is that Mr. Mandela had died many times on Twitter. And we were very, very careful not to repeat the mistake. And also we were very proud that we never fall for the trap. So we took it very seriously. And the minute you broadcast on BBC, you get calls from the White House, from Number 10, from everywhere. So you can't be making breaking news on Twitter just by mere rumor. So yeah, I was outside just when we knew that President Zuma was on the move, and the host broadcaster, which was already appointed, the SABC, we knew that their trucks were already outside Union Building, so we moved our trucks.
Sure, and of course, it's not that government was sitting back and doing nothing, and I'm sure they had prepared long before that day, right? Years before, I'd like to believe. What did you call it? You call it what, the M plan, right? And anticipating the deluge of media inquiries about the state of health of Mr. Mandela and the inquiries about whether he had passed on or not. On the day, it must have gone crazy. But just briefly give us a sense of how you had prepared for the day.
Yeah, maybe let's go back to the M plan. It wasn't an easy thing to do. So what Milton explains is that they started going around. They came to us, they went to the union buildings and they were chased away. There were other colleagues of his from CNN and other broadcasters. They all went, spoke to people at the union buildings, spoke to some people at GCIS, and they were sent away and said, no, go away, we don't do it this way. How do you discuss people while they are still alive? Now, I joined GCIS in 2005, and one of the first things I had to do, so as they got chased away, they came to me, and I didn't chase them away. So we worked together with my other colleague at the time, Harold Maluka, And we said, no, let's listen to these people. And they said to us, well, we've got to plan. And what they said made sense to us. Now the challenge was to convince our leaders at GCIS to say, can we do this thing? So I was Harold's boss at the time, so I went. I had to speak to senior management. At the time we were led by Joel Nechitenje. And I went to the management and I said, look, we've been talking to all these broadcasters and they are concerned that we're not planning. And they say, planning for what? I said, no, we've got Mandela will go one day. We've got to plan because the whole world will be here. Then they say, okay, what do you want us to do? I said, we've got to create a project plan and identify all the things that we need to do to ensure that we give him the best send-off, one in which the whole world will participate in. So, again, difficult. We've got to go and convince the people at the union buildings. So they say, well, while we try to do that, what do you want to call this plan? Do you want to call it Mandela? We can't. I say, no, let's call it the M plan. So we called it the M plan and the project was started. So we then started meeting now formally with Milton and his colleagues, photographers, broadcasters, all other media, including the SABC, of course. And in a short time, we had worked out the whole plan and presented it, because there was now a whole team at GCIS working on this thing. So there was a semi-permanent plan known as the M plan. All of us knew what the M plan was. And later, of course, it was easy for us to convince the leaders at union buildings. We started with Iso Pahad, who was responsible for communications. And once he bought into the idea, we were able to speak to the other people. And then that inspired government to set up a bigger M plan, not only for communication, but to deal with all other matters that were important. So indeed, government had a plan, but at first it wasn't easy because people thought in our culture we can't start planning for somebody's funeral while he was alive, but we realized that, as Milton said, Mandela was more than just a South African. He was a citizen of the world, and you had to work such that the whole world should be able to give him the proper send-off.
And it was not just the announcement that Nelson Mandela had passed on that was important.
Yes.
Other key things became important immediately thereafter. Now, the logistics around receiving high-powered delegations, heads of governments, yes, and members of the public who were interested in also sharing their grief and mourning. A whole range of things that had to happen in the lead up to the funeral. I want to talk or take a comment or question from the members of the audience here, our colleagues in the media who would like to also share their thoughts with us. Vuyo, are you here? Because there's this misunderstanding. I don't know if I should refer to it. Because, it was not a pleasant experience for you outside Mill Park, right? And people always confuse or link that incident to this discussion. And it isn't linked whatsoever. But
no,
yeah.
Not at all, Tim.
Well, but to correct that once and for all.
Well, I mean, which had always known. I mean, Angie spoke about what radio had planned, but from the television side, we had known for years that when the day came, I would be the first to go on air, because the protocol was that a sitting president would make the announcement. So from the our M plan said I needed to be on standby. So which created a lot of problems for a person with my kind of life. Because there would be times when like he would be admitted to the military one hospital,
Yes.
and my life stopped right there and then, because I couldn't do anything else but wait. But of course, when the day came, in fact, I was just going past Kilani when a similar call to Angie's came and said, "You've got to come back." And hours later, of course, I was the first to go on air in all the 4 SABC television channels to make the announcement. But what was more interesting for me was that even though we had a plan in place, the people of South Africa took over. And the first 48 hours, that plan went out of the window. We were just had to contend with people who were flooding our studios everywhere across the country and wanted to pay tribute to Nelson Mandela. And that's how it went.
But I think also it became very dramatic, as I say, in the lead up to the funeral. And I'm not sure if there's a colleague who wants to share their thoughts with us. Stephen, you were at Prime Media 702 at the time. So let's hear what was going on in Sandton.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, good evening. I was at Prime Media at 702 at the time, and my story of the passing, I'm afraid, is slightly embarrassing in that I got a phone call from a foreign number at midnight, and it was an Australian radio station saying, "Can we talk to you about Nelson Mandela?" And I said, "He's in hospital, he's fine." And he said, "No, he's passed away." And I said, "Nice try, buddy," and I put the phone down. He says on live TV. So what I remember firstly was that people who are normally not accessible at certain times were accessible. I had known for a long time that Jesse Duarte, for example, who was Deputy Secretary General of the ANC then and still now, had been his personal assistant during the early 1990s. And I phoned her at about 4:45 that morning, and I said, and the worst thing you can do as a journalist is to phone someone and not know if they know. And I thought she must know. But what if she doesn't? What if she was asleep and put her phone off or something? And I mean, there's like no way to start that conversation. And Jesse was very warm about it and knew immediately why I had called and did a fantastic interview. And I think there was one thing that journalists and South Africans could do at that time, which we can't always do, which was we could be a lot more human with each other. I remember there was an event at the SABC on the Friday after he passed, and Greta Mantashe called me all the way from the top of the bottom of this sort of big theatre, and said, "Come and give me a hug." Now that's not something the Secretary General of the ANC would do under normal circumstances, or now. And so it was. There was a moment of real humanity, I think, in relationships between most journalists and most politicians that we don't see. And I mean, sometimes there's maybe a lesson there that we could do with more of that humanity, particularly at the moment.
Well, we'll explore that issue about what's going on in our society today between politicians and the media. But I think, and we're likely to agree on this, that we also began to see a shift in how South Africans viewed politicians and political power. And this happened at an event where I suppose government specifically would not have liked to see that happen. And that was the memorial at the F&B Stadium, when we had all this high-powered people, UN Secretary General attending, the American President there, British Prime Minister, and heads of governments from elsewhere. Yeah. And then a particular section of the stadium saw it differently, that thing. Yeah. Who would like to comment on that?
Let me just jump in here, because I want to make an example about the lack of planning. One of the best examples of the lack of planning is the sign language translator. Okay, I know you want to talk about the booing of President Zuma, but actually, okay, the story that became the biggest story out of South Africa during the morning of Nelson Mandela, our liberator, was some fake guy sign languaging next to the most powerful man on earth, Barack Obama. Now, that is lack of planning. So if someone had planned very carefully for this day, they probably would have found the right person. Okay, so clearly, this was done without much thought. No one took it seriously, and look what we ended up with. So, and then of course the South African internal politics started playing themselves out on international television. So we are talking about the legacy of Nelson Mandela. Spent 27 years in prison, came out of prison, told his jailers, let bygones be bygones. Unheard of. Not just in South Africa, not in Africa, in the world. Unheard of. And people are asking you about this, and suddenly they're like, tell us about the sign language guy. And I'm like, what about it? Tell us about, there are rumors he doesn't know what he's doing. And the guy is.
So the story shifted now. The story became, at the memorial, the story was about the sign language guy.
And remember, we still.
And where is the sign language guy?
We are still going to Kunu for the burial.
Yes.
This thing is already shifting, all right? So, and with social media, you know, this thing absolutely kind of took us by surprise. So we've got a plan. We need to be following the coffin, the lying in state. People will be lining up the streets, and the army will be there doing its, you know, and suddenly we're talking about a guy we've never heard of, you know?
Yeah, I know, well, we can laugh about it, but it's actually disappointing to be reminded of such a moment. And in itself, it sort of was telling a story that things are no longer, you know, going to be the same.
Yeah, no, I wanted to come in on the incident that you're speaking about, the booing. I think it was quite, it was a big, significant thing, because Zuma, if we remember, had been re-elected in 2012 in Mangaung, and he was very triumphant, and he was, you know, he really felt, you know, I've got my second term, I'm in charge. And it was that particular incident that turned things. It was the beginning of the turnaround of people saying we cannot be taken for granted. And I think that and a lot of people said that it was inappropriate for people to be booing at Nelson Mandela's memorial, kind of like, and embarrassing the country in front of the world. But actually what the people were saying was that this person that we are saying goodbye to is what we want our country to be. This is how we want to see ourselves. And you who is in charge of us today, you are the antithesis of this particular person. And it was very fascinating that even foreign leaders, the Barack Obamas and the so on and so, they got big cheers. And the leader of the liberation movement at this particular juncture was the one who was actually, who was booed. And what that led to, I think basically then the ANC began to realize at that particular point where Jacob Zuma was, kind of like how people really felt about Jacob Zuma, that they had to use the memorial service of Nelson Mandela to send a message to him and to the party. So much so that the following year, when the January 8th statement of the ANC, it was the launch of their manifesto for the 2014 elections in Bombela, the ANC had to do a lot of groundwork to make sure that people do not embarrass the president when he delivers his speech. I mean, I'm not sure if you can call it a speech, but he reads something.
Okay. Moipone Malefane, let me find out from you, I mean, how you saw the mood of the people and how they expressed their sorrow on one hand, as well as their unhappiness about the state of affairs, because it was mixed. You know, if you were at the stadium, that's what you got. But even generally speaking, in the broader public, of course, people were going to view the body and the coffin, but at the same time, there were complaints everywhere. So, you know, it was like the fatherly figure of this nation was no more. And in some quarters, the feeling was, but who is going to pull it together now? It was like a realization that the honeymoon is over. Things have changed. Tell me.
Although I wasn't really part of the covering of the funeral, but I was there, and I agree with you that the South Africans took over. I think him being in and out of hospital, in a way, prepared South Africans that one day he will go. So the mood, everybody was celebrating him. That night, the whole team, everybody came, and I think the access was very important on the day that the family, as well as in Soweto, people were allowed to go to Mama Winnie's house, and people were allowed also to come to his home here in Horton. And people celebrated on that night. And also the memorial service, also it was quite big. It rained, and everybody was there. although the booing that Mundi Makanya is talking about. But one thing that happened in terms of the preparations, I worked for Sunday Times. Obviously, there were preparations that were done because we all knew at some point this will happen. I went to Sowetan. We all prepared, and as you can see, we had all different front pages, but they were all celebrating the men.
Right, let me come back to the panel again, that there was also a sense, I think, from that time, and it continued for years, that Nelson Mandela was gone, and he's gone with his values and the things that he stood for. Was it a realization, or was it something that was realized within newsrooms that, you know, the kind of things that media would be happy to cover, the reconciliation stories, the nation building stories, that those stories were beginning to die and that it was no longer going to be the case? Sally, you want to go?
Well, I think that when he passed, it was like losing a parent, that you realize you are the next generation. You are now the flag bearers. And that was a very sobering realization, that there was going to be no wise person saying, look, don't go in that direction, you've got to go in this direction. He kind of left us to it. That's what we had to do. And I think that we were aware that we were never going to be in such a special time again. You know, we talk about the miracle, and yes, we talk about the Rainbow Nation, and we say it's cliched, but we did feel that we were part of something truly miraculous and special, and that in a way we were delivered from what could have been a horrific time. But I think what's happening now as a country is that we are coming to terms with the real difficulties of getting over what apartheid did to us. And in a weird sort of way, I was thinking about it earlier, I feel that Nelson Mandela and what he brought in, it was almost like stabilizing a critical patient, that the critical patient was us as a country. He stabilized us. And then thereafter, now we are in that phase of having to have the tough operations, really going into the body to see what is wrong at a very, very deep level. And that is painful and that hurts. But this is the necessary excavation that has to happen for us to truly, truly heal.
And Sophie Mukwena, did you notice that there was a shift now in the way news diaries were being compiled within the newsroom? Because I recall, and I'm sure many of us here would remember, that in a way, Nelson Mandela, the person, did not mind to channel, to set the agenda personally if he had to, by calling journalists, specific ones, to talk to about this, that, and the other, and then sort of to get South Africa on message. I think people were not willing to break rank and highlight certain things more than the others. But the story was always that of a nation that was marching forward, was trying to get itself together. But did you notice any particular shift that time?
Well, let me start by explaining my relationship with Dada. And it is a very difficult relationship because here I was as a journalist having to do my work. But how he would interact with me was more of a daughter. It was very, very warm. Every time when he entered this very same room, right now I feel like I can cry. He would look at the audience and look for Sophie Mukwena, and he would start by saying, "Hi Sophie, how are you?" And then they know now the press conference can start. If I'm not here, no press conference. So the instruction was that you must make sure that you sit in such a way that he can see you, so that he can carry on. Otherwise, it's going to cause chaos, demanding that, where is Sophie? So that was my relationship with him. So when he retired, I was specifically asked, I think Vuyo was still my boss, the political editor at SABC, and Snoopy was still head of news, that I must cover Madiba as a retired president. And then when there was a shift in terms of news management, the new news management, I don't want to mention names, they took a different view. And
Speak
there was a
freely,
perception.
Sophie, you're amongst friends.
There was a there was a view that Madiba is not a story anymore because he's retired.
Oh.
The focus must be on the sitting president.
Okay.
So unfortunately, I would come back with stories. At times, the stories wouldn't see the light of the day. And this was making Madiba very angry. Because all the time, I had to be in that Falcon 500 of the defense to go and open schools with him and clinics and what and what. So I'd come back, no story. And Madiba one day took a decision to come to the SABC to speak to the management. When he arrived there, no one was there to receive him.
Unbelievable.
It was bad. What he did, he looked for Sophie Mokoena, and the security called me to say, you have a guest. Who is this guest? He said, 10 black cars. What? 10 black cars, yes. When I was about to approach the lift, and then the lift opened, and it's Madiba and Zelda, I remember very well. What am I going to do? Second floor. I'm just a journalist. I requested the office. I sat there, and then he said, I was here to speak to your bosses. They are not here. I'm very disappointed. I said, Tata, but I'm a junior staff member. The only thing I can do, I took a Maranza, I recorded him an Easter message. But my heart was so sore. And then he left. Which speaks to, yes, he wanted to set an agenda, but it was for the good cause, because his belief was that if he gets coverage with those schools and clinics, more from business will come and you'll change more lives. But people didn't do that. And coming to as passing on, I got a signal at 4 o'clock because I had a very strong relationship with both families and everybody around him, because they knew I had access to him. So, and then I spoke to the management, news management, to say, guys, be on standby. Those who are responsible start pulling together the teams. And that's exactly what happened. And I came to Horton around 5. I was already here because I knew it was happening until the announcement. So that's how it happened. And yeah, but
so,
Madiba...
So indeed, you know, it's a mixed bag kind of story. And what you've just told us actually highlights the shift that I was talking about. I did not expect it to be that way. You know, I thought it was, you know, a generalized feeling that things are changing, but in your case it was specific.
Because the other thing, during the announcement of the World Cup, I accompanied him to Zurich. After we won the World Cup, I was the only journalist at the back, you know, when he went out. And he uttered words that stayed in my mind. Even today, I can still see his face when he said, I have done what I was supposed to do. Now I can see my grave. I can rest with peace. And I remember he wasn't feeling well. So I've lots of behind the scenes stories and how he was able to prepare you for anything. And he would, do that.
Yes.
I'm not a journalist. But my reflections, you asked a question about celebration. My home is not far from 8115 in Orlando West. And for me, the celebration of his passing, even though it was in a different tone altogether, was similar to the anticipated return of Madiba from prison. There was that camaraderie that we couldn't explain. I know it was raining, but no one wanted to go and sleep. And when Madiba passed away, it was the same situation. But on that evening, I was with my brother seated on my right-hand side here. Here's my brother here, Zodo. We're from a celebration, a party. And we got word, it was around 7, that it was not okay in Hudson. Quickly went home and we changed. And when we got to that home, we could sense that a lot was not right. But what comes to my memory was when the medical team came from upstairs, downstairs, and the grandchildren and children went upstairs. Nobody said anything to anybody. They came back and they sat down. But what I remember quite vividly was when the military took out Madiba's body. It was quiet, and they went down. Being a singer, the first thing that I was able to do, because there was no time where you could say, "Astandazin," you know, the traditional thing when a body goes out. But I blurted, "Liza lisitinga lako." Little did I know that that was a family hymn. So for me, that is a memory that will live in. The other things for me tend to be secondary, you know, the stadium and what have you, and the burial. Because as you rightfully say, it was more now of a celebration. But being prepared, we're never prepared for the passing away, even at the time when he was hospitalized.
Well, I can imagine that a lot of people actually, as much as we knew that he was not well, when the news came that he's no more, many went into denial about the fact. Because it was like news you did not want to embrace and accept. Angie, let me ask you to swap with Leanne as we continue. I'm not sure if Nomboniso Kasa is here with us. I did not see her. Is she around? No? As we make the swap, I want to pick up on what you said, Sophie, because that first-hand story that you tell, many people here who work for newsrooms would kill if they could for the privilege that you had of having that access and to be told that he's no longer a story anymore. I'm sure if you spoke to Stephen there, he wishes he could swap places with you and turn the clock back and be in your position there. How could you say, you know, but in any event, the mood in the country was changing, was shifting, as we saw immediately that time. I'm not sure if you began to see the same, Sally, that the way the news diaries were being compiled, that we're now beginning to tell other stories. And maybe let me start first with Milton. Milton, as an international journalist, journalist working for an international organization, did you see the request from your editors in London and producers?
After the burial?
Well, in the lead up to the burial and then immediately thereafter. Did you see a change in terms of the types of stories that were being asked of you to cover?
Yeah, so because you see, the key thing is that when you work for a broadcaster of the size and magnitude of the British Broadcasting Corporation, you do get a sense of the globe. So even when I'm sitting here and I'm covering state capture, I'm very much aware that if Trump says something, that's my space where I could have reported on state capture and it knocks it off the scale. So I'm always watching out what's coming up that would disturb us. And that's what would happen even then. You would be saying, oh, I'm outside Soweto with the crowds, and be like, we've seen the crowds, can we just go to Washington, there's a crisis, we'll come back to you.
So, and this was the lead up to the funeral.
That's what happened. You need to swap now, because you can see that you've gone from the high of Nelson Mandela has died, and now you're looking for the implications, the significance, which is one of the important things that the BBC is quite good at, is understanding what news stories mean.
The meaning of
not just telling you what actually happened.
Sure.
We tell you this is what has happened, but this is what it means. And so, for instance, take the lying in state, which we had prepared for a very long time. It involves a lot of people, engineers, editors, production, all sorts of things. We had to hire rooms across the union buildings, so that we could have a view of the union buildings for the lying in state. And now you have people filing past the coffin. You need to know who's coming. You know, if it's Nelson Mandela's daughters, it's Zinzi and Zenani. But who is the one in front? Is it Zinzi or Zenani? Someone must know all that stuff. You can't prepare it on that day. Do you understand? You can't turn up with 10 cameras at the union buildings on the day of the lying in state and say, where can we plug these? Okay, it needs to be prepared a long time in advance. And therefore, when you are doing that kind of story, and you've got a breaking story out of Afghanistan, 10 British troops dead or something like that, they would have to say to you, well, we'll come back to you. We know it's an important part, but let's go and see what else is going on around the world. So that was the change of the mood. But also you could see the internal politics were beginning to be raw now. The infighting within the ANC and the sort of, you know, whole thing about President Zuma and the different factions that were coming up. So that was beginning to be, that's what Mandela's passing means. But also let me remind you, and I'm sure many of you would know this, there was a book written by a former SABC journalist called Lester Fenter called When Mandela Goes. I'm sure he got a few royalties in 2013, long after the book was published, because he had predicted sort of a doom and gloom kind of situation. And everyone was hoping that it was not true. And you still believe that it's not true. So it's still very hard to deal with the problems in a post-Mandela South Africa. It's not because of Nelson Mandela that you know, we have the problems we have, or because of his passing. It's because life has moved on, and now we've got, you know, corruption, and it doesn't mean that it didn't exist while he was still alive. So it's a much more complex situation.
And Sally?
Yes, definitely it was the big story. A lot of people, a lot of journalists, people in the media wanted to cover that story. That was the story that people were waiting for. And definitely internationally as well, it was the big story. And I think after he passed, there was a sense that the big story was over. I was looking on Twitter just now and noticing that the 5-year anniversary of his passing is not trending anywhere on Twitter. Maybe on other platforms. Where I looked, it's not trending. And what do we say? What do we say to remember him? You know, do we ask ourselves what would he think of politicians' relationship with the media, a man who stood for media freedom and freedom of expression, a man who defended the rights of journalists? Would he be horrified at what is happening today? You know, we can only guess what he would say. We can only go by what he said in the past. So I think that in a way it's up to us. It's up to us to remember that a lot of the values he stood for are good, honest, true values. Fairness, freedom, balance. And that for me as a journalist guides me and certainly guides the organization that we work for as well.
Well, I suppose Leanne's life was disorganized, where you're used to waking up around 3, 4 in the morning to go to work.
Yeah.
When Madiba passed on, you had to stay up the whole night anyway, I suppose.
It was ridiculous. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to put this down. But I think my story is very similar to Vuyo's story. We had, I'm going to take you back into the planning that Milton's been speaking about. And not to downplay the SABC's planning, but the planning was for years in the making, to such a point that we'd be called into studio for rehearsals, and you'd have to, I would cough now. Can I pass to someone else? Clear my throat.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I think that night was really quite a remarkable evening, and I remember being on air that night, and the news was being sent through to all the different journalists in our network. And I could hear, at that stage we had quite an open studio, I could hear the noise of journalists, engineers, sound technicians, crew members filling up that studio. I'm wondering if you had a similar experience, Leanne, where the noise and the buzz just kept coming up higher and higher and higher. And what we had as well is we had people phoning us from all over the world saying, I want to speak, I want to go on air and tell you how much you meant to me. And just the outpouring a little earlier just reminded me of that. We all have something that changed us, an experience we had with them, no matter how small, no matter how big or how involved. And people wanted to share. It was like a national therapy, an international therapy session in a way. Leanne, do you feel the same way?
I think so. And I mean, just getting back to the planning. So we would actually be called in, and this was a few years before, to actually sit down at the news desk and make the mock announcement and say, ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this broadcast to bring you a message of national importance. And we would say it over and over again. And then we would introduce inserts that were going to be played on the night, inserts that South Africans had never ever seen, because the work that was happening behind the scenes, the documentaries on Mandela's life, the music that was compiled to speak to the story, to the soundtrack of Madiba's life that people were desperate for because they would hear that song playing the entire time and it would just automatically bring tears to your eyes. So, you know, I remember I was called in on many occasions to rehearse with the late Vuyo Mbuli, and we were told that do not leave a certain radius of Johannesburg, because when you get that phone call, you have to get to the SABC. We used to drive around with a black suit in the back of our car. You had to have the black suit in the back of your car, get to the SABC, be made up on air within an hour. And that was the mandate that we had. And it was always, you know, that would happen and then a year would pass and nothing would become of that M-plan.
One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Lip sync test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
I was so burnt out that when it actually happened or was about to happen, I was entering Mhlanga. In the KZN, I actually had to make a U-turn, you know, because we were told it's inevitable, it's going to happen. And Milton, my brother, I think you would agree that there was such precise planning that we used to have things like called day D-1, D-10, leading up to the actual the date of, you know, so from a capacity perspective, you know, I think it's not only the public that came to the party, even public servants, even those that were not, you know, meant to work on the plan, everybody felt Nelson Mandela touched all of us. People who were on leave came back and actually wanted to provide support because we all knew that this was going to be the event that was going to be the glare of the world. And, you know, one thing that I'm encouraged about is that the relationship between government and the media, you know, that how we work together to make this happen. Nobody wanted to see it fail, you know. So we worked together, and Tim, you talk about then and now. You know, that event is a true example that if we put our minds to something as South African, we can actually do remarkable things. You look at the World Cup, you know, and it happens specifically when we think that the world is watching us, right? So I think we need to rise to the occasion that says that we can do it, and we've done it, and we've demonstrated it so many times that we can form these relationships that actually can work very well for our country. What I'd like to leave here is that, you know, we as South Africans, media, government, the public, let's use this experience of Nelson Mandela's death as one that we should look back to and say, what have we forgotten? The values, the morals, you know, what worked then that can't work now? And together, let's go back to claiming our rightful place,
well,
you know, in the space.
I agree with you, and let's explore how we do that. And Mondli, this task falls to you. And I think, in a way, what Sophie Mukwena said earlier on sort of gives a sense of where things began to change somehow. And also the fact that the person of Nelson Mandela himself, who was media friendly anyway, notwithstanding whatever issues he had to address at any given time. So not because he was a great person to cover from a media perspective, but he also welcomed the role of the media, right? But when you look at the change over time up to now, Mondli, what do you see?
You know, it was quite a, okay, now I'm going to go back a bit to 1999. So I mean, like we had, okay, I'll go back before 1999. Okay. Yeah. You know, there was a time, I think it was 96-ish, 95, 96-ish, because, you know what, the ANC, when the ANC came into power, there was an expectation that it would have a bit of a honeymoon. And the media didn't give the new ANC government a honeymoon. Immediately there were stories about, you know, the gravy train and so on, and people were being held to account. I mean, like, which was a good thing, it set a good tone. And at some point, the senior editors were called in, black editors, were called in by the ANC, by Nelson Mandela, and top people in the national executive, to Luthuli House to be given a tongue lashing and a finger wagging about that. Basically, you are one of us. We struggle together. We should be building this country together. And the black editors, they stood their ground and said, no, no, no. This is what our role is as the media. And actually, they stood up to Nelson Mandela. And, you know, from that day, I mean, like, and it's not like Nelson Mandela was basically trying to censor the media, was trying to sensitize them to the bigger project. But, you know, he became the biggest defender within, even in closed sessions, I mean, like where we were not, where there was no public, no cameras, no media, and he became, within the ANC, within the NWC, within the top 6, anything that when he sensed that people were going the wrong way in terms of attacking the media. So anyway, but let's go to 1999. Then there's a change of government. So when Mandela leaves in 1999, quite a remarkable thing that happened. He went to every single newsroom in the country to say thank you to everybody for the relationship. And it wasn't, and he spoke to every single person in that newsroom. And it wasn't like he addressed kind of like a room like this, and he would just simply shake every hand. And it was a thing, and it was genuine. I mean, it wasn't someone, he didn't need us after that. I mean, like, he's gone. But, like, obviously he would need us for his projects and for the good work that he was going to be doing. But then what happens is that somebody comes in who is a bit, not quite sure about being overshadowed by someone of that stature. And I think what Sophie experienced was probably a symptom of that there were people who were trying to protect that person from being overshadowed by Nelson Mandela.
Well, let's broaden this in this fashion, right? That as much as we're talking about Nelson Mandela, let's talk about the relationship between the media and some of the powerful, influential politicians in the country. Because it appears, and I'm sure we'll agree, that, that some politicians understand the role of the media differently or perceive the media to be the enemy that has got an agenda. On the other hand, in recent times as well, I've seen some colleagues within the media also conceding that there are things that need to be improved upon because they may have taken a much more activist stance in addressing the big political issues of the day. And then you throw in the element of social media into the equation, where people comment and say what they want to say there, and that seems to have gained traction to the extent that it can even become the dominant view of society, whether informed or not informed. Let me put you on the spot. Let me put you on the spot to just help me specifically and us in general to gain a better appreciation of the developing views out there, especially in the on the social media space, where people believe that they've got a right to say whatever they say, whether it's factually true or not true. As long as it's a popular view, then that view is valid on the basis of its popularity. Whereas typically in a professional media setting, the point is it factually correct? Is it true? Have you verified? You tell me.
Thank you, Martin. Obviously, I wasn't necessarily expecting this question, but I think it's a very important one. I think, the media plays a very important role in post-democratic South Africa. And to a certain extent, and these are my personal views, I don't think the media or some media practitioners anticipated the extent and the influence of social media to a certain extent. What people ordinarily were used to is radio, newspaper, and stuff, and once it moved and became a digital age. Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My point really was, I think the advent of social media has made it very interesting. To a certain extent, in fact, has made it more inclusive. People who did not have a voice now do have a voice. And they are able, not to take gospel, be it from the media or any other person, and can interrogate it and basically form a view as a result of that. Now, the question in my view is, is it the right way to do it or not the right way to do it? And I think it places certain obligations to a certain extent on media practitioners, media houses, to actually be factual when reporting certain events. Sure. I think the impasse most of the time always arises where you find a headline, it's very interesting, and when you actually read it, it's either based on allegations or we could not verify and stuff. And there's always that issue of potential clickbait and stuff. And I think, there is an opportunity for collaboration, for people to get in and work on, because actually media freedom is a constitutional right, and I think it ought to be protected, it needs to be respected, and people, society and the media can work with each other and enhance that.
All right, let's get the microphone here to Hajra. I would like to hear your views, Hajra, on this particular matter, that it looks like, tensions have flamed up in recent weeks, and particularly the EFF seems to feel very strongly that the media is the enemy, and they say so anyway. Or some members of the media.
I'll never forget a conversation I had with President Cyril Ramaphosa now outside the house in Houghton about the way forward now that Mandela's gone, and how his big shoes would be filled and whether another leader could ever step into Mandela's shoes. And I agree with Mondley in terms of that being the period where I think politicians tried to appropriate Mandela, tried to appropriate South Africa. And at the stadium, at FNB Stadium, when the booing happened, I got off the TV and I went to find out why people were booing. And they were booing because they could not hear what was happening on stage. So they did not want even Jacob Zuma or Barack Obama to appropriate Mandela's memorial in that moment. And a lot of the and even as the hearse went through when the coffin landed, people complained that it drove by too fast in Mthatha. And I think the attempt to appropriate South Africa in that moment, to appropriate Nelson Mandela in that moment, and the response by ordinary South Africans is the response to the question on the EFF. Because be it Nelson Mandela, be it the country, be it our democracy, be it our constitution. I mean, the constitution is a piece of paper. It can be changed. It's writing. But whether South Africans allow that to be appropriated by any one person. And it takes me back to my conversation with Ramaphosa, who was not relevant at the time. And he kind of read the mood of the country, read the mood of the ANC in that moment. And then to throw it back to the EFF, the question is whether the party is correctly reading the mood of the country as it says and does what it does. And I think the elections will tell that story.
Any comment from the panel?
Yeah,
Or
but
from the audience?
Tim,
Yeah.
I think you say it's activist journalism. I think it's advocacy journalism. And I did have this discussion with some of my colleagues, including Hajra, that, of course, I work for government. I don't want people from the media to praise me or to praise my boss or praise my government. They need to deal with facts. Facts, nothing must never stand in the way of facts. So whether they like so-and-so or they don't like so-and-so, whether we believe Zuma is corrupt, state capture and all sorts of things, let the facts speak. Because we do need the media. You know, somebody spoke about this thing of the mirror and say, you know, in the olden days, there were no mirrors. So people couldn't see how beautiful they were because there were no mirrors. They could only tell. They could only know how beautiful they were when they were told by those who were looking at them. So the media must continue to be that mirror. We shouldn't look at the mirror and now there's technology, beauty cam, I can beautify myself with a phone and so on. We don't need that. We have to protect that journalism so that even when there are things that we're uncomfortable with and journalists want to tell us, we must listen. So now when the mirror tells you that actually you are ugly, you must accept. But that mirror is the journalist,
but here's
the media.
Yes, and I'm picking up on what you're saying.
Yeah.
And this is my sense. And Tumi, I asked you to comment on this. And please, I'm opening it up again, that we should have this conversation, right? My sense is that there are people who think media, all of it, journalists are Stratcom. There's the word. Right? It's shorthand for whatever. I don't know what it is. I mean, why people would believe that anybody who comments on television, radio, newspapers, everywhere, or investigates a story, publishes it, is therefore Stratcom. And I think it's gaining traction that people believe that, you know, that you can just make that one broad sweeping statement and have that view. that, well, it's up to you, it's optional to believe the truth or not to believe it, even if it's factually true. Sally?
I don't believe in silencing any voices. I know recently there's been some journalists saying, well, we shouldn't broadcast, for example, EFF press conferences because they take direct swipes at the media. I think it's problematic that that is happening, but I think for a country where we were censored for so long, we can never take that route again. But I do think that the responsibility for media houses is to fact check. I agree with you. The facts must matter. And you know, if you look at what's happened in the United States, CNN, for example, they have a campaign Facts First because every time Donald Trump is on air, if he says something that isn't true, they fact check him and they say, actually, this is the case. And I think that you know, you can say anything on social media. You can lie on social media. And it can gain traction for a number of reasons. Our responsibility in the media is to check those facts, to give everyone a fair hearing, and not to automatically take a position. And this is where I'm quite old school. I don't believe I'm the story. I like to believe that I listen to stories. I want to hear your stories to try and get to the closest possible version of the truth, bearing in mind it's not a perfect science and we'll never get there. We have to stay as objective as we possibly can be. We have to have an open ear and an open heart to all the different politicians, all the different stories out there, but that doesn't mean we can't question those stories, interrogate those stories, and be cynical. That's part of our job.
But there is another problem, Tim, we have with social media, and which is that people do get to the habit of just reading one line on Twitter and making up their minds on massive policy issues, and sometimes exposing themselves of the lack of reading. And the problem is that, for instance, it is worrying for international audiences to see young people in South Africa who were born after the end of apartheid saying Nelson Mandela was a sellout. People don't understand that. And they're asking,
where does it come from?
What's happening?
Where do you think it comes from?
What's happening?
I'm actually baffled by that too.
Well, when you say to people, you know, this man was locked up for 27 years in prison, can you be a sellout if you're in prison for 20? And then they're like, oh, 27? I say, yeah, that's the guy you say is a sellout. And they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. If he was for 27 years, you know, so you can see that there is a school of thought that speaks from ignorance and being influenced by people who are information peddlers, people who have got nefarious agendas, and they just swallow it without thinking. And that is the problem that we are facing. And in fact, the need for an independent media and top-class editors in the newsroom has never been greater, not just in South Africa, not just in Africa, in the world today. Because if you see something on Twitter, you have to go and verify it on BBC News, okay, just to make sure that this is true.
What if it comes from ENCA now? You still have
well, we have to verify from BBC.
So one of the, I just want to add to what Milton was saying, which is quite interesting, is that the world is a crazy place, and it is, and the leaders in this world are even crazier. It's, you can quote me on that one. But the reality is, you talk about the concentration of people. I was listening to a talk one day, and they were saying that people's concentration levels in the youth today, and because of Twitter, social media, and all of this stuff, a human being's concentration level is 8 seconds. A goldfish is 9 seconds. A goldfish is doing better than a human being these days. And that gets to your point of saying people read a headline and believe it.
And the emotions kick in.
140 characters is what Twitter used to be. And they believe that as opposed to clicking on a story and reading it for what it may be. I don't think journalism necessarily is failing us. I think people are failing us. They are not reading enough. They're not educating themselves enough. And yes, journalism is to blame because we should be putting out the headlines that are true. We shouldn't be taking little slogans from people that say one word and then that's the story that you click on and you go into it, and it actually isn't even what the story is about. And that's very, very wrong. And we are playing on the fact that people don't want to read anymore. They just want their news in a headline and will believe anything and spread anything. And it's dangerous. It's a dangerous world.
Monty, I'll come to you in a moment. And, okay.
No, that's fine.
Hello?
To the audience.
Let's hear from you. Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nkululeko Ngubane. I'm a citizen. I just want to come back to what Milton touched on when he spoke about preparedness. I was on the ground on that day in Vilakazi Street. I'm not disputing that the local media had a plan, but it must have been a very sophisticated plan. I recall because I was interviewed by about 3 international media who were strictly looking at kids, because they understood that Madiba, you could never complete a story about Madiba without speaking to kids. And I believe that they end up having a better coverage. I can tell you, I don't know where those interviews are. I find them as I'm searching Google, but just imagine if they were curated, locally. So that was the lack, and I can say that international media, they end up covering Madiba better than we did, of which is unfortunate.
Okay. Well, to come to...
No, it's fine.
Go ahead.
Yes, good day. My name is Sean Harris. I'm a freelance stills photographer. And as I see your panel up here, and even within the audience, it's a pity that I don't see so many stills photographers. The simple reason why I say that is the common denominator in all Madiba and his imagery was the stills photographers. We carried his image worldwide. And those stalwarts, Alf Kamalo, Julian Negwe, and the older other stills photographers that managed to capture his image and help put it across the world, I'm sorry to see that we're not actually represented here in that manner, even giving the voice of how, again, it was planned. And I say that because of the way that I, as in a member of the Foreign Correspondents Association first, was brought in on the beginnings of an M plan, or this is what we were told, etc., etc. Again, we were asked for our allegiance to the silence of it, which we gave. And at the time, there was a number of, I was representing the stills photographers. But then again, the information dissemination from higher echelons was very sporadic and not even coming forth sometimes. But other things that happened at that time, and especially up to the run of it, still questioned me as a operator here in Johannesburg, South Africa for last 20 years, and watching how the system went into practice or into operation to cover it. We had covered many other operations before, as in accreditation, etc., etc. And those details, how many different times, again, even before Madiba's passing, or the notification, the worldwide notification of it, again, did media, that's photographers and whole media, had to fill out the accreditation documentation over a number of period of years, up to 5 times. And then on the day of collecting our accreditation, 6-7 hours in a queue because the system wasn't up and running. But while I was in that queue, luckily, even though that the day before, I had come down to Lutuli House and I saw my picture. And I said to the photographer and the gentleman who was Simpiwe, who was hanging the ANC pictures up, but that's my picture. And he said, well, how come? I said, well, we'll find out. So that was on the day of the 6th. And then after that, it really snowballed. Going to GCIS, and not a single door opening. Going to the government, and not a single door opening. Wherever it was, the door was closed. And it's a pity because I'm saying that, because of what Dada stood for, and us as photographers, again, it was my aim to capture not only his legacy while I was here, but I'm talking about intimately, as close as we could. Sure. And photographers how many times we are having here in this room. I mean, I've even my own private book is 100 Faces of Nelson Mandela. 100 different times I've captured him. But then again, when I saw my picture honoring him on the funeral or even before his funeral, I started to question. And then when I was knocking on the door of the higher echelons and saying, this is my picture, I would like to first to find out how you got it, where you got it, etc., etc. Now, because of the cases in the High Court, because I've been forced to go to the High Court, even though that I've written many emails to the system.
Let me suggest
but we'll go that another day.
Yeah.
Yes,
let me suggest something, Sean.
But I wanted to,
When I take the point, because we've got Tabo here, we've got.
But we won't go into it now because it will be just it would be just through the gate of the court because we're in court.
Because it might actually be resolved here today.
Well, I would like it to. I would like it to.
And that's why I'm intervening now, if you don't mind, to say I'm asking them to attend to what you've just said now, so that somehow this matter gets resolved as speedily as possible. Is that all right?
That would be perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Mondli, I'm coming back to you.
Okay, that's fine. Now.
Absolutely now.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, I just wanted to say, you know, just to your question about why it is that this narrative that Milton spoke about, why it was able to gain traction. I think, you know, we don't realize the devastation of the past decade and how bad it was. I mean, fine, I mean, like we know the SOEs, what happened there. We know the corruption. We know what happened to the economy. We know what happened to various institutions. But I think very, very important is actually kind of like the fiber of the society, both the moral fiber and the thinking. It was a decade of thoughtlessness, where basically you could get away with anything. And when those who were in charge of the looting, those who were in charge of the country at the time, wanted to put forward a narrative about the 1994 deal having been a sellout deal, and therefore Madiba having been a sellout, it was actually very easy to put out there. You know, Andile Mkutama can say it and we dismiss him. But once it gets into the mainstream of the governing party, and it actually starts to be propagated and perpetuated by people within the leadership of the ANC, as happened particularly in the past 5 years, then that's how it gained traction. So when the Rhodes Must Fall students, they latched onto that. The Fees Must Fall students latched onto that the reason why we have been left behind is because of what happened in 1994. The reason why we cannot afford fees is because of 1994. And I think, I mean, like, that's where we need, and then just finally, just to get back to Neo's point about like, can we recapture that, that spirit of 2013? Yes, it is possible, but it will take a lot of work and a lot of time because just of how toxic the Zuma years were.
Yeah. Well, I think we should conclude this, and I'm going to take 3-4 comments to conclude. And my question point is this: the media, is the media chacharach too much, to the extent that it needs to be proscribed somehow? It needs to be controlled because they become the law unto themselves. And I'm saying this, you know, with all seriousness, because I'm of the view that people take that view very seriously and believe that, you know, somehow the reports that we hear will sort themselves out if only the media stayed out of telling us, investigating and telling us the truth. I'll come back to you, Mel. Let's get the other lady there to share with us her thoughts.
Oh, okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Sitro Qelishe. I am the National Communications Manager for the Economic Freedom Fighters.
Aha, you are the right person now. To respond to that question.
I needed to hear everybody else speak, and then, you know, I can take it now. But maybe before that, to just, you know, touch on Utata, when he passed on, I happened to be part of the communications team at the time. And the experience that I still hold with me even today was then the conversations I had with the leadership, reflecting on the kind of person that he was, the personal stories, like Usis Sophie was saying. Those, for me, made me realize that actually maybe we didn't know who Tata was, because then now when you were beginning to converse with the people who were close to him, it was a life-changing experience. Now I cannot not address the issue of the media. It's funny that the media feels attacked. I'll start, with the media people on your panel. We've got Useli from the ETV group. Our leaders go there all the time. We've never turned down any interview that they request unless we've got other, commitments that we have. So our leadership goes there, starting from the commander-in-chief himself. He goes and engages them there. With Milton, he knows he's had like a couple of interviews with us. He calls us to say, can I speak to the commander-in-chief? I'm trying to show that we have a relationship with the media, that whenever we can, our leadership engages them on the issues that they want to be engaged in. We've called out SABC on many times in censorship, in a lot of things, but we go there, we do interviews. So for media to feel like they are victims when we point out the wrong things that they're doing, it's surprising. Are we supposed to sit back and allow editorials to have a position on the EFF? No. The simple rules, one of the journalists actually mentioned it just the other day, that the rules of journalism are simple. Be factual, be fair, and be balanced. And we found out that in the past couple of days, that the media is something that they're not doing. We have journalists who are putting our leaders at risk. They publish their addresses, they publish their number plates. What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to sit on the sidelines and say, oh, well, it's a journalism job? It's not, So when they cover stories, you find out that they don't even have evidence. Their stories are too thin. And when we challenge them, they take that as an attack on the media. There's no attack on the media by the EFF. But whenever you do something wrong, we will not let it slide. We will have the conversation with you when you want to have a conversation with us, but we will not allow opinions. We cannot state that we cannot not question why opinions are making, front pages. They're not stories, they're not headlines, they're not, they're just opinions, but those are the things that have been going on, and those are the simple things that we are pointing out, that look, we've got a different type of journalism. Just
a quick point before we move on. I want to ask a question.
All right.
Ask you a question. Do you feel or believe that the EFF is being singled out by the media as a collective, that of all different political parties and political leaders in the
even
country,
if the EFF is not being EFF is not being singled out, but we've got a right to challenge the media. You cannot speak alone. Unfortunately, we cannot let you speak alone. So when we pick up something wrong that has got to do with the EFF, we obviously have a right of reply. We have a right to challenge it. We have a right to question it. There's nothing wrong with that.
I understand. Yeah. You remember what happened with, I think it was the ANC led by Jackson Mthembu. And they went to, was it Parktown or somewhere?
Gallery.
Rosebank, sorry. So
the spear situation.
So it does happen, you see. and Mel Mondli would remember that, I suppose. And I'm going to take a couple of comments. You've got the mic there, man. I'll come to you. Stephen, you write for the Daily Maverick as well. I would like to hear the perspective from Daily Maverick.
Tim, you asked a question about the media being jatarach. Here one has to really compliment the media. And we are focusing on 5 years gone by. That when Tata died, the media gave the family space. Because what I described earlier on really needed that type of space. And the journalists, or the media,
was indeed very understanding. They really respected the family and did give them space. So that is a very commendable exercise. You know, there was no rush in wanting to take photographs. No, it was done properly and with utmost respect. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you know, I know my colleague. Give them a chance.
Well, and that does reflect preparedness. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Let's get the microphone here. Well, you go ahead, Stephen. In the meantime, whilst we bring the microphone in front. Can we bring it here? Well, go ahead, Stephen.
All right.
Whilst I sort out
Thank you.
my logistical challenges.
I can't claim to represent the media or even Daily Marek. I'm just one of the many workers there. Several things on the media. Firstly, the media is as fractured as our society is. It has as many different beliefs. You know, one of the things we haven't even touched on is the behavior of some media organizations that damaged other media organizations in the period just after Nelson Mandela passed. And I'm talking about one particular newspaper group that, you know, seemed to do things that were very difficult that affected other news organizations. That's just one thing. When it comes to the EFF, there are many things to say, but I don't think anyone in the media has ever advocated any kind of war talk against any member of the EFF that I'm aware of. And if they did, I would condemn them for it. But the EFF repeatedly uses war talk and does not disavow war talk from its supporters on Twitter, ever. My friend Ranjani Munsami gets, you know, threatened with physical assault, with rape. Where's Julius Malema condemning that? I mean, where is it? Is he like other political leaders we've seen in this country from the ANC, I'm afraid to say, who also did not disavow threats of violence against, you know, but in their name? So I would have to say that there is a huge difference between what the media is reporting. What Jacques Poe did was obviously wrong. I mean, of course, I would never support that, and I would join many others in condemning it. But at the same time, we cannot say that the EFF reporting, that the media reporting on the EFF is war talk, but I think we can fairly say that the EFF's response, and particularly in targeting certain journalists, comes across as war talk to my ears.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, and then let's bring the microphone here. Go ahead, and then I'll bring that microphone here in front.
Thank you, Tim. My name is JJ Tawan. Just.
Hey, sorry, I can't see you, JJ.
I see the light, this too, clearing, yes. Yeah. Just briefly to say, and coming to your question about what are we going to do about the relationship, I think that there are problems on both sides, right? Of the media on the one side and the politicians, the government, etc. on the other. So on the media side, obviously there is a need to refamiliarize ourselves with the basics of reporting fairly, reporting factually. Right? I hear what my colleague there from the BBC is saying, bragging about the BBC. The BBC journalists there in 2010 reported outside the Bafokeng Stadium there, and I was in London at that time, and watching BBC there, saying, there is no hotel here 5 miles from this stadium. There are more than 10 five-star hotels, stone's throw from where he was standing. But he was saying that people who are coming to a World Cup must bring tents so that they can set up their tents not far from where the English team was training. And I wrote a letter to the BBC, but how can you report such rubbish? You know, so glaringly.
And that was before EFF, right?
So I'm just saying, generalizations are bad, even for the BBC. It's a global organization. So there are a few rotten apples there. Right? The idea is not to say all media are so terrible, they must all be brought to a tribunal. It's to say, let's agree on the basics, and those who depart from them on the media side, all of us, including those who are in the media, must then condemn those people. Same on the side of the politicians. Right? I mean, it again is another set of miseducation. So the politicians now say, oh no, the media must just report the facts only. No, but the media is a combination of facts and opinion. Just deal with it. Right? And journalists or some commentators are not journalists. They're going to write based on what is an opinion, and they can ask for a right to reply and reply. With social media now, you don't even need a right to reply from Monty. You can tag him at City Press and reply to what you're saying. Right?
Or make him famous.
So I'm saying there are certain basics. I mean, a lot of editors are complaining that government communicators, I mean, if you go to the independent newspapers, it's surrounded by some 10 government departments. a walking distance. But those editors will tell you, no, the last time they received somebody to come and just say, hello, I'm so-and-so, I work for MEC so-and-so, would be decades ago. And I'm saying those are the basics that should be fixed, that there's a need to invest in a relationship between the politicians and the media. The same way you invest in any other relationship. And we need to stop with the generalizations. They're not going to work. But also be able to call each other out. I agree completely with what Lisa is saying, that the politicians must be able to criticize the media. But they cannot ask for some amnesty where they must be treated with kid gloves because they are so radical and they can get the whole, red ends descend on you if you say something wrong and so. The EFF in particular has a thin skin for criticism. They are over there with files on everybody and so on. When you touch on them, they really behave as if now they must be left alone. It cannot happen. But they're not different from the ANC. I mean, the ANC has 5 spokespersons. They contradict each other. When you point that out, they say, no, don't do that because, there's democratic centralism, etc. So yeah, there seems to be a need, in line with celebrating Nelson Mandela, to go back to the basics. By the way, without worshipping Mandela, because he also, as Mondli was saying, he also got it twisted a little bit to say, hey, blacks must report this side. No, how can you report with whites? Whites are controlling you. That narrative continues. But he planted a little bit of that seed himself because he expected favors when he came out of prison that people would worship him. Because it happened, because all of us wanted some peace and quiet after all of the years of trouble.
Thanks, JJ. And this is, you get the final word, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm Sello Mokoena. I'm a researcher and an independent writer. My question is very straightforward, is that to what extent really are the media supposed to, or to what extent is it ethical for the media to start looking for a commercial value as and when they plan for a funeral as big as that of Tata Mandela? Because during those times, I was the spokesperson and communication manager for the Gauteng Department of Health and Social Development. I was approached by a lot of guys from marketing and sales during the time to say that they want to prepare a story, they want us to look good. Then I told them that no, this story is out of my hand. The story has to be dealt with GCIS. That's my question. Someone will say we want to drumbeat the story, we'll drumbeat and make you guys look good. So to what extent are the media really, or to what extent is it ethical that people should be looking for a commercial value?
Draw the line when it comes to commercial interest, right?
Yeah.
And Sidlo, you're going to speak now, and I'm not sure if there's a volunteer response. Sophie, you're volunteering a response?
I think there's a serious challenge in this country, in all sectors, for us to go to the basics. It's not about media only and politicians. All of us in this country, we have a serious problem. And my fear is the coming elections next year. The way the environment is polarized, the anger, the hatred, we can't come together, as Tata taught us, to engage, even though we differ, and end up saying, yes, we don't agree on this one, but at least we were able to vent the anger, we were able to discuss. Therefore, for me, all of us as South Africans, as the African continent, we must go back to the basics. Do what our forebears taught us, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere and them, that you can only resolve your differences by sitting on the table, disagree to agree, but finally leave that room, at least all of you, going back to ensure that you become better people and you ensure that your country is better.
Sure.
And the issue of commercializing Madiba, it's a problem. Madiba is being commercialized even in his death by many people. I don't know how are we going to deal with that, because we have forgotten our culture and the principle that he stood for. And I think we must go back to the basics.
Thank you. All right.
Tim, can I just 30 seconds?
Okay. And
20.
then let me bring you up.
Squeeze through.
As if well, I have to start the hymn here, start singing to bring you up. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Now, and while he's up there, I hope he acknowledges the team that Madiba supported finally. No, I just wanted to say that, you know what, I mean, like, just to, it's gloomy because we went through the period that we went through and so on, and we didn't bottle the values that Madiba left us. But But you know what? We are in 2018, sitting here in December, beginning of December 2017. This was a different country. The mood was very different. We're not out of the woods yet, but we are in a totally different space, and we're starting to rebuild. And I think that let's value the fact that a lot of work has gone into this year. And I think it's important that we don't walk away gloomy.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. If I may say one thing, because it's been playing on me, is the gentleman in the front here, I'm not sure who it was, he said that the international media did a better job than we did in covering Mandela's story. I have to dispute you, and I have to end this on a positive note. I think we did a damn good job. As South Africans, we told a story that no international organization can ever tell. And that's a lesson in itself, that if we do not protect this continent, if we do not protect our country, and a lot of journalists are they're in this job to protect the interests of South Africans. Motley speaks of a time that we've come from, and if it wasn't for Gupta leaks, if it wasn't for journalists that put their neck on the line to ensure that the truth was told, we would not be in this position right now. We cannot be hard on the media, but the media need to be also cognizant of the fact that we need to go back to basics. Yeah. We need to investigate what we report on. But I end on this note by saying, nobody can tell our story better, and we must stop speaking ourselves down, because we are damn good at what we do.
What? Thanks very much. Okay. The media has taken over now.
That's our job.
Now I understand.
You must never miss an opportunity when you have the microphone. I was taught many years ago. I want to echo the words of my fellow Buccaneer, Mondli, about not leaving this place gloomy. This place is the Nelson Mandela Foundation. It carries the hopes and dreams of millions of people, not just in South Africa, but across the planet. Tonight, we are remembering the passing of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela brought hope to South Africa, brought hope to the world. We cannot leave here feeling gloomy about the day-to-day ins and outs of our battles. I remember one thing that Nelson Mandela said, which stayed with me for many years, and my wife Dorcas will hate me for it, because this is my favorite quote, and she says, please don't say it again, love. But love, there is no better moment than tonight. The glory of life lies not in never falling, but in rising each time you fall.
Thanks, Milton. Well, and of course, for all of us, we shouldn't forget we have a constitution, right? With all its faults, it actually gives all of us a sense of the direction we should take as a people. The preamble, in particular, for ordinary folk like myself, who don't get to go to high courts or constitutional court disputing anything. I just go through that to understand what this beautiful country of ours is all about and what kind of nation we should build going forward. And we're all in it together, man. Even EFF. So we mustn't forget we're on the same boat, even when we, hold different views. And the point that's been made that probably were it not for the media's, most of the things that have gone wrong in the past decade or even before, we would not know. Even today, I think people are always looking out, what is it that's going wrong? And where do they go looking for that? They check the media. And if the media does not tell the story as is, including the parts we don't like, then we will fail as a people. Thank you very much for having been a wonderful audience, and to my panelists, thanks again for hosting.
Thank you so much, Pratima. I thought we shouldn't also end on a gloomy note. These Pirates fans are now claiming things they shouldn't be claiming. That's fake news. For those who are available for a tour, Sophie has seen it. There's evidence downstairs in the archive. You cannot dispute the archive of Madiba that Madiba was a Chiefs fan. So I'll be here. I'll be available to the Pirates fans to take you to the archive immediately. But I think we missed a story that Dr. Maseba would have told about where he was when Madiba passed. But I thought with that theme in mind, I should then challenge us to say, I hope that the question that we won't be asking ourselves henceforth won't be, where were you when Madiba died? it will be, where were you when Madiba's legacy was destroyed? By the corrupt, by those who do not care about the society he wanted to build, by those who, for 9 years at least, destroyed every fabric of our society and introduced mediocrity of the worst kind in our system. That those who stood up and started to boo, they didn't just boo JZ, but they started booing Madiba's legacy too. And that booing should then remind us that legacies are not something that's static. It needs to always be, to relive, to be something that's active and can be relevant to those who are still alive today. That mediocrity should take us back to 1999, when Dr. Jack crafted a beautiful, and again, I'm happy to take you downstairs for you to see this cartoon, where at the time that Madiba wanted to retire, he then crafted the words, "You have to learn to let go." But letting go is difficult. When Madiba is us and we are Nelson Mandela, and we are always trying to then find a Madiba in ourselves, may we find a Madiba in ourselves. Try to build a country that is values-based, the one that cares about those who are forgotten, those who are discarded, those who are 51% of young people who are jobless. May we care about that enough to help build this country of our dreams. We are dreamers. We are forever going to be dreamers, but we have learned from Nelson Mandela that dreams alone are not enough. We have to work for those dreams to be possible. Let me close off by saying, for all of us here tonight, I hope that we'll continue to counter every kind of fake news that then says there is no hope for South Africa. But that the ancestor of hope, as Madiba was called, as he is on the other side, he must be looking back to say, hope is the one thing that kept him alive in prison. So he was there for 27 years, almost 28, but he kept on to that hope. Who are we to lose that hope? At the point where we should be holding on to it, in fact, because it's when we are tested most that the steel comes through. I thank you very much for coming through, and I want to thank ENCA for being our partner tonight, and also to indicate that the center will be open during the weekend in memory of Madiba. So you are welcome to bring your families from about 9 to 3 o'clock, Saturday and Sunday, until the 16th. I think we will be open for those 2 weekends. And that we have drinks downstairs, because I'm told reliably that journalists drink a lot. So there's
fake news, fake news, fake news.